The prairie stretched endless and empty, a sea of grass silvered by moonlight. The stars above burned cold and distant, scattered across the heavens like the eyes of forgotten gods. The wind moved low and restless, tugging at the dry weeds and stirring up whispers that only the lonely could hear. Elias Thorne rode through it all in silence, a lone cowboy with no one waiting for him, no home but the saddle beneath him. His horse, a weathered gray mare named Bramble, snorted against the chill, her hooves striking the hard earth with a steady rhythm. Elias tugged his worn coat tighter, though the night's cold wasn't what gnawed at him most. It was the hollow ache inside, the memory of a family he had buried long ago, and the life that had slipped through his fingers like sand. He had gotten used to the quiet. Nights on the trail were always empty, save for coyotes howling on the horizon. Yet that night, something unsettled him. He slowed Bramble, tilting his head. At first, he thought it was the wind, whistling strangely through the dry reeds by the creek bed. But then he heard it again, faint, fragile, almost too soft to be real. A voice. It carried through the night like a dying ember refusing to fade. Elias stiffened, his weathered face tightening beneath the shadow of his hat. He listened, holding his breath. "Mama." The single word was so broken, so impossibly small, that for a moment he thought his mind was playing tricks. Elias had been alone on the trail for weeks. Solitude had a way of whispering ghosts into the ears of men. But then it came again, weak, trembling, barely more than a sigh. "Mama!" Elias's stomach knotted. He spurred Bramble toward the sound, his heartbeat quickening. The night seemed to sharpen around him, the wind dying down, the stars glaring brighter, as though the whole world had fallen silent to listen with him. He guided his mare down the dry creek bed, her hooves crunching against the brittle earth. Every step carried him deeper into the dark, his senses sharp, eyes searching. Then he saw it, a shape, small, still. Half buried beneath a tumble of brush and sand, a burlap sack lay twisted and torn. Something inside it shifted weakly, a sound like a kitten's mewl breaking the silence. Elias swung down from Bramble, his boots crunching against the stones as he hurried forward. His calloused hands gripped the sack, rough fabric scratching his skin as he pulled it open. The sight inside made his blood run cold. A baby. Her skin was pale and chilled, her tiny lips trembling as she gasped for breath. She couldn't have been more than a few days old. Her frail arms flailed weakly, her little fingers curling and uncurling as though reaching for something that wasn't there. And then, with eyes barely open, her mouth formed the word again. "Mama!" Elias staggered back, his breath catching in his throat. The sound was broken, ragged, impossible, and yet it pierced through him with the force of a bullet. His chest ached. He hadn't cried in years, not since the day he put his wife and son into the earth. But now tears burned unbidden at the corners of his eyes. He reached into the sack, lifting the fragile child into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, her warmth flickering like the last glow of a dying fire. His weathered coat, stiff with dust and sweat, suddenly felt like the only shield between her and death itself. "Easy now," Elias whispered, his voice trembling as he cradled her against his chest. "You're not alone. Not anymore." The baby whimpered softly, her head resting weakly against him. Elias looked down at her, his jaw tight, his heart pounding like thunder in his chest. He glanced around the empty prairie, searching for tracks, signs of who had left her here. But there was nothing. No campfire, no riders. Just silence, and the cruel fact that someone had meant for this child to die. His fists clenched around the tiny bundle, anger boiling beneath his grief. Whoever had abandoned her, whoever had tossed her away like refuse, had no right to call themselves human. But amid that anger came something else, something Elias hadn't felt in years. A spark, a purpose. For so long he had wandered with no reason to live beyond the next sunrise. Now, in his arms, lay a reason. Fragile, helpless, but alive. He mounted Bramble with the child pressed close, wrapping her in his coat. The prairie stretched on, vast and unforgiving, but Elias no longer felt the same hollowness inside. The whisper of "Mama" still echoed in his ears, but now it carried a promise. This child would live, and Elias Thorne would see to it, even if it cost him everything. The prairie was a cruel place for the weak. Elias Thorne knew that better than most. But as Bramble's hooves carried him away from the dry creek bed, The tiny weight in his arms reminded him that cruelty had taken on a new, unforgivable face. The baby stirred faintly, her cries brittle and fading. Elias pressed her closer, feeling her fragile heartbeat against his chest. She was alive and barely. And yet that was enough. "Hold on, little one," he whispered hoarsely, his voice cracking against the wind. "I've seen men twice your size give up with less fight. Don't you quit on me now." But as he rode, unease coiled in his gut. The sack he had pulled her from wasn't just tossed aside by chance. The knot had been tied deliberately, the cloth heavy and damp as though weighted to sink in water. Someone hadn't merely abandoned this child. They had intended her grave. The thought burned through him like fire. He pulled Bramble to a halt, glancing back at the creek bed. In the pale moonlight, he dismounted again, laying the baby carefully inside his coat on the saddle before kneeling beside the burlap sack. His rough hands searched through the sand around it, and soon he found what he feared: boot prints. At least 3 sets, pressed deep and fresh. His jaw tightened. Outlaws. He'd seen the kind of men who treated life like currency, who thought nothing of breaking families, leaving graves in their wake. But this was worse. This was innocence cast aside. A flash of something sharp pierced him. Not just anger, but memory. His own son, Daniel, barely older than this child when fever took him. He remembered the tiny weight in his arms, the way his boy's hand had clutched his finger before going still forever. Elias's breath hitched. He closed his eyes briefly, then looked down at the baby once more. Her lips parted weakly, her eyes fluttering, and for a moment he swore he heard that word again. Softer now, like a dying ember. "Mama!" The sound tore him in two. He gathered her up again, wrapping her tighter. "I ain't your mama," he whispered, voice breaking. "But maybe God put me here to stand in her place." Mounting Bramble, Elias pressed his heels to the mare's sides. They rode hard toward the faint lantern lights of a distant ranch house he knew stood a few miles east. But his mind raced faster than the hooves beneath him. Why would men abandon a child like this? Why leave her in a sack at the edge of nowhere? Unless... The thought chilled him more than the night air. Unless she wasn't meant to survive. Unless someone feared what her life represented, a secret, a danger. He glanced down at her again, studying her tiny face. She was fragile, helpless, and yet the kind of men who buried her alive feared her enough to want her erased from the world. That meant protecting her would not be simple. Whoever left her here might come looking, and if they found she'd survived, Elias knew what men like that would do. He looked ahead, his eyes hard beneath the brim of his hat. "Let 'em come," he muttered. "They'll find I ain't the sort of man who lets go once he's taken hold." The prairie stretched endless around him, the stars bright and cold. But Elias Thorne's heart burned hotter than it had in years. He had carried death long enough. Now, in his arms, he carried life, and no outlaw alive was going to take that away. The prairie wind cut sharp against Elias Thorne's face as Bramble thundered eastward, carrying him and the fragile bundle in his arms. The baby stirred weakly, a sound more breath than cry slipping from her lips. Elias lowered his head close, his chest aching at the faint life clinging to him. "You hang on, little dove," he murmured. "Don't you dare let go now." Every hoofbeat brought him closer to the lantern glow of the Blackthorn homestead, a place where he might find shelter, milk, and warm arms to cradle the child. But Elias's thoughts weren't settled. They stormed like thunderclouds, the sack, the prince. The deliberate knot meant to drown her in sand and silence. This wasn't abandonment. This was execution. And if men could do that to a baby, then they wouldn't hesitate to do worse if they realized she still breathed. He slowed Bramble near a ridge, pulling the reins tight. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at the stars. His jaw worked, but no words came. Then, slowly, Elias swung down from the saddle, his knees hitting hard-packed earth. He set the baby in his coat upon the ground, the prairie grass whispering around her. Her tiny hand reached upward, curling as though to grasp the sky. Elias's throat burned. He pulled his hat off, bowing his head. "Lord," he whispered hoarsely, "I don't know your ways. You took my boy when I begged you not to, left me with nothing but shadows and whiskey bottles. I cursed you more than once. Maybe I still do. But tonight you dropped this child in my path. And I'll be damned if I let the same grave swallow her that swallowed Daniel." His hands trembled, but his voice grew harder. "So hear me now. By the dirt under my boots and the stars above, by the blood of my kin and the fire left in me, I swear, this girl will live. Whoever wanted her dead will have to go through me first. And I ain't laying down easy. The vow hung in the air, heavy as iron. The baby whimpered, her fragile sound breaking the silence. Elias's heart clenched and he gathered her back up, pressing her to his chest. His vow wasn't just words now. It was carved into him like scar into flesh. Mounting Bramble once more, he rode on, his eyes like steel beneath the brim of his hat. But in the distance, behind him, a shadow moved. Boots pressed into the sand where Elias had found the sack. A man crouched low, his features hidden beneath a wide hat. His fingers traced the burlap, then the hoofprints leading away. Slowly, he rose, lips curling into a cruel grin. They didn't finish the job, the stranger muttered. The cowboy's taken her. The man whistled low, and from the ridge above, 2 other figures stepped forward, rifles slung, eyes sharp. Together they followed the trail into the night. Unaware of the hunters on his back, Elias pressed forward, the baby's faint warmth steadying him. He thought only of finding safety, of keeping his vow, but safety was already slipping further out of reach. The prairie had heard his oath, and it would soon demand a price. The moon rode high, pale and cold, casting silver across the prairie. Elias Thorne leaned low over Bramble's neck, urging the mare into a steady gallop. The baby pressed against his chest was too quiet now, her breath shallow, fragile as a candle flame in the wind. Elias's jaw clenched. He'd seen that stillness before, in men on the battlefield, in his son before fever took him. It was the silence that came just before the end. Not you, he growled softly. Not tonight. The glow of the Blackthorn Ranch flickered faintly in the distance, but every mile felt like a battlefield. His mind replayed the vow he'd spoken under the stars. If God had set this child in his arms, then Elias would not fail her, but shadows were moving behind him. Unseen to Elias, 3 riders cut across the prairie, following the trail of Bramble's hooves. Their leader, the man who had crouched by the sack, rode tall in the saddle, his coat whipping in the wind. His name was Calder Voss, a man whose cruelty was whispered in every saloon from Ash Hollow to Laramie. A man who never left debts unpaid. Beside him rode his brothers, Joran and Silas, men bred on blood and whiskey. They didn't speak much as they tracked, but the gleam in their eyes said enough. They had unfinished business, and the cowboy carrying it wasn't half as dangerous as the secret in his arms. Calder pulled his reins, slowing his horse as they neared a ridge. He raised a hand, signaling silence. Bramble's hoofbeats echoed faintly in the still night air. Calder's smile was thin as a knife. He's running east, Calder muttered. Toward the Blackthorns. Fool thinks he'll find sanctuary there, Joran spat. Should have drowned the brat ourselves. Now we've got a chase. Calder's eyes narrowed. Doesn't matter. He won't get far. No man can outrun us on open prairie, not with dead weight in his arms. They spurred forward, their shadows stretching long across the moonlit grass. Elias slowed Bramble near a patch of cottonwoods, his instincts gnawing at him. The prairie was too quiet. Even the coyotes had gone silent. He pulled the reins, letting Bramble breathe, and listened. Wind whispered through the grass. The baby gave a soft whimper against his chest. But beneath it all, he heard something else. Hoofbeats, faint, steady, but closing. Elias's blood ran cold. He turned Bramble sharply off the trail, guiding her into the cover of cottonwoods. Once hidden, he swung down quickly, pressing his back against the bark of a tree. His heart pounded as he listened, his hand brushing the butt of his revolver. 3 riders. At least 3. Their hoofbeats carried steady and sure, men who knew how to track, how to hunt. The baby stirred again, a faint whimper slipping out. Elias froze, his palm gently covering her mouth, not harshly, but with desperate care. Shh, he whispered, his voice breaking. Stay with me, little one. Just stay quiet. The riders passed not 50 yards away, dark outlines against the horizon. Elias caught sight of them between branches. Tall men in long coats, rifles strapped to their saddles. His gut twisted. These weren't drifters or cowhands. These were hunters. When they vanished over the rise, Elias let out a slow, trembling breath. He mounted Bramble again, but this time his pace was careful. Every move mattered now. He wasn't just carrying a baby, he was carrying a target. Hours stretched like years. The ranch lights grew closer, but Elias knew the outlaws weren't far behind. He could feel it, the way a man feels a storm before it breaks. He thought of his vow, of Daniel's face, of the life snuffed out too soon. This child was a chance he hadn't been given, a life to save instead of mourn. And he'd die before letting her fall into the hands of men like those. The prairie wind shifted, carrying a sound that confirmed his fear. A whistle, sharp, mocking. Elias twisted in the saddle, his eyes narrowing. On the ridge behind him, the three riders reappeared, their silhouettes stark against the moon. One raised a rifle, the barrel gleaming. Elias yanked the reins hard, spurring Bramble into a desperate sprint. The mare leapt forward, hooves pounding, dirt flying. The baby whimpered at the sudden jolt, but Elias held her tight, his body shielding her as the crack of a rifle split the night. The bullet whistled past, splintering bark from a cottonwood. Elias didn't flinch. He leaned low, urging Bramble faster, his teeth clenched against the rush of wind and gunfire. The outlaws gave chase, their laughter carrying over the prairie. Calder's voice rang out, cruel and confident. "Run, cowboy! Run while you can. She won't live to see another dawn." Elias's heart thundered, but his grip only tightened. He whispered fiercely into the baby's ear, his vow burning brighter than ever. "Over my dead body, little dove. Over my dead body." And as Bramble flew across the prairie, the light of the Blackthorn Ranch flickering nearer, Elias Thorne knew the fight had only just begun. The ranch lights burned brighter with every pounding hoofbeat, flickering against the night like a promise of safety. Elias Thorne urged Bramble forward, his arms wrapped tightly around the fragile bundle pressed against his chest. The child stirred faintly, her soft breaths warming the hollow of his neck. Almost there, he thought. Just a little further. The Blackthorn place stood like a fortress on the open prairie. Timbered walls, wide corrals, and a stout main house built by men who understood both the cruelty of nature and the greed of men. Elias had traded cattle with them once, long ago. They were tough folk, decent. If anyone would help him protect the baby, it would be the Blackthorns. Bramble's hooves struck the hard-packed earth of the yard, drawing startled faces to the porch. A lantern flared and a grizzled man with a shotgun stepped forward. "Who rides at this hour?" he barked. "It's Elias Thorne," Elias called, sliding off his horse, one arm clutching the baby close. "For God's sake, let us in. There's a child." The old rancher, Thomas Blackthorne, froze when the lantern's glow revealed the tiny face peeking from Elias's coat. His hard eyes softened. "Get inside, boy, now." Within moments, Elias was ushered into the house. The warmth and smell of firewood wrapped around him. Thomas's wife, Margaret, gasped when she saw the baby, rushing forward with blankets and a pan of warm milk. Elias gently passed the child into her arms, his body trembling with both relief and exhaustion. She was left to die. Elias rasped, his voice hoarse, buried in a sack tied to drown in sand. I pulled her out. "And there are men!" A sharp whistle cut through the night air outside. Everyone froze. Elias's heart clenched. He knew that sound. Calder Voss and his brothers had found them. Thomas set his jaw, moving to the window. He blew out the lantern. Darkness swept the room, broken only by the flicker of the fire. From the shadows, Thomas's voice was grim. "Voss, I should have known. You know them?" Elias asked, already reaching for his revolver. "Aye," Thomas muttered. "Ranch burners, thieves, men who'd sell their own kin for whiskey. If they've trailed you here, it won't be talk thereafter." Outside, hooves circled the yard. A mocking voice rang out. "Calder's sharp as a blade! Evenin' Blackthorn! You've got something belongs to us. Hand over the babe, and maybe we'll let you keep your walls standing." Margaret clutched the child tighter, her eyes wide with fear. Elias stepped forward, his silhouette outlined by the firelight. His voice rang hard through the room. "She belongs to no man alive, and you'll have to step over my corpse to touch her." Silence followed. Then laughter, cruel and cold. "Then your grave'll be a shallow one, cowboy," Calder called. Shots cracked in the night, bullets splintering the porch rails. Horses screamed in the yard. The Blackthorn house shuddered under the first blows of the siege. Thomas shoved a rifle into Elias's hands. "If you brought hell to my doorstep, Thorne, then you'll damn well fight it with me." Elias nodded, setting his hat low over his brow. Wouldn't have it any other way. They took positions at the windows, returning fire as shadows flitted across the yard. The Voss brothers moved like wolves, swift, merciless, circling the house with torches and guns. Inside, Margaret rocked the baby near the hearth, whispering prayers through her tears. Each gunshot made her flinch, but her arms never loosened. The child whimpered once, then fell silent, as if she sensed the storm raging around her. Elias's heart twisted with every cry of lead. He had sworn to protect her, but the odds were long, and death was circling close. Still, his vow burned hotter than fear. Between rifle blasts, he shouted across the room to Thomas. "They want her dead for a reason bigger than money. What secret could a child carry that 3 grown men would kill to bury it?" Thomas fired through the window, grim-faced. "Some truths make men afraid, Thorn. Afraid enough to kill before they spread." Elias's stomach churned. Whatever this child represented, it was dangerous enough to summon murderers. Dangerous enough to demand her death. And yet, as he reloaded his revolver, he looked toward Margaret's trembling arms and felt nothing but iron resolve. The siege raged on, the night split by flame and thunder. The ranch house shook under every strike. But within its walls, a cowboy's vow stood firm, unbroken, unyielding. And as dawn's pale light began to creep across the horizon, Elias Thorn knew this fight would not end in surrender. It would end in blood. The first light of dawn bled across the prairie, casting the Blackthorn Ranch in a pale, ghostly glow. Smoke curled from shattered timbers where the outlaws' torches had licked the walls. The night had been endless gunfire and thunder, but now the world held its breath, waiting for the last blow to fall. Elias Thorn crouched by the window, his revolver heavy and near spent. Sweat and soot streaked his face, but his eyes burned bright. In Margaret's arms, the baby stirred, whimpering softly. She was alive, by miracle, by grit, by sheer refusal to surrender. But Calder Voss wasn't finished. Through the haze of smoke, Elias saw him ride forward, dismounting with slow, deliberate grace. His long coat whipped in the morning wind, his rifle slung across his back. He walked into the yard, bold as a king, while his brothers flanked him like wolves. "Enough games, Thorn." Calder's voice cut like steel. "You're out of bullets, out of walls, out of time. Hand over the brat, and I might let the rest of you live." Thomas Blackthorn, wounded but still standing, spat blood into the dirt. "You'll get her when hell freezes." Elias stepped through the broken doorway, revolver in hand, his body shielding the house behind him. The sun edged over the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. He squared his shoulders, staring Calder down. "You came to bury a child," Elias said, his voice raw but steady. "But you'll leave buried yourself." Calder chuckled darkly, nodding to his brothers. "Kill him. Then burn what's left." The Voss brothers raised their rifles. Elias moved first. His revolver cracked, and Joren staggered back, clutching his shoulder with a howl. Silas fired wild in return, the bullet grazing Elias's arm. Pain seared, but Elias pressed forward, ducking behind a water trough as lead tore splinters into the air. Thomas fired from the window, dropping Silas to his knees. The outlaw cursed, crawling for cover. Calder strode closer, drawing his pistol, eyes locked on Elias. "You think you can stop me, Thorn? I've killed better men than you for less." Elias rose from cover, both men raising their weapons in the same breath. The world narrowed to a heartbeat, to the space between one trigger and the next. The shots rang out together. Elias staggered as Calder's bullet grazed his side, tearing hot across his ribs. But Calder jerked back, shock flashing across his face as Elias's round struck true, burying deep in his chest. Calder dropped to his knees, eyes wide with disbelief. Blood blossomed across his shirt as he gasped, choking. He reached out, fingers clawing the dirt, but his strength was gone. "You don't know," he rasped. "That child. She ain't just—" His words died with him, his body collapsing into the dust. The yard fell silent. Joren dragged himself into the saddle, clutching his wound. Silas stumbled to his feet, pale with blood. They looked once at Calder's still form, then at Elias standing tall, revolver steady in his hand. Their courage broke. Without a word, they fled into the rising sun, leaving their brother's corpse behind. Elias lowered his weapon slowly, his breath ragged. The fight was over. Behind him, Margaret stepped from the house, the baby bundled in her arms. Her face was wet with tears, but her voice trembled with awe. "You kept her safe. Just like you swore." Elias turned, his body aching. but his eyes softened at the sight of the child. She blinked up at him, her tiny fist reaching toward the light. He knelt, his voice low and fierce. "No man will ever bury you again. Not while I draw breath." Thomas limped forward, resting a heavy hand on Elias's shoulder. "She's got a chance now. Thanks to you." Elias looked to the horizon, the sun spilling gold across the prairie. His vow had been tested in fire and blood, and he had held. For the first time in years, the emptiness inside him eased. He had lost a son once, but now, by fate or providence, he had been given another chance. Not to replace what was gone, but to protect what still could be. He rose slowly, tipping his hat to the baby with a weary smile. "Welcome to this world, little dove. It's cruel, but it's yours now. And as long as I'm breathing, you'll never face it alone." The prairie wind swept across the ranch, carrying away the smoke and blood, leaving only the promise of a new day, and Elias Thorne, weary cowboy, broken father, and sworn protector, walked into the dawn with the child who had turned his vow into purpose.